I'm Colin Sutherland, Executive Vice President at Geotab. We want to introduce you for our very first Connected with Geotab podcast, where I'll be interviewing various executives here at Geotab and some of our partners as well on trending topics. Our goal with this podcast is to create a connected community where listeners can locate a variety of topics and connect ideas and to formulate new ones. Each episode will feature a different thought leader sharing their perspectives, their expertise. And today we're very fortunate to have with us Ed Kohlberger, Senior Vice President at Geotab. Hi, Ed. How you doing?
Hey, great, Colin. Thank you very much for having me here. Really excited and looking forward to being the first pioneer on this hopefully replicated podcast issue. So really exciting. So thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. You know, it's the world outside of Geotab. While we as a company have an awful lot of subscriptions in North America, really you have such global insight with your past experience. You and I have known each other for almost 14 years over the years and past lives in telematics. I know we've both been around this industry for almost 20 years. So your insights are really valuable, and your thought leadership across the spectrum is very welcome. And today, I think specifically, we're really interested in your perspective on Europe and what's happening in Europe. We talked about decarbonization and CO2 and GDPR, but maybe you can sort of unpack some of those thoughts and kind of hit the high marks for yourself and then go as deep as we can have this conversation today.
Sure. So first of all, I think, it was ballpark, 14 odd years ago when you and I were on a panel together in Chicago at Insurance Telematics. I think we had met briefly a couple times prior to that. And that was interesting. You were just coming out with, I believe, the Go 5 device, and I was with a competitor who's now actually part of Geotab, that being WebTech Wireless, that was acquired by BSM. And it's interesting that the telematics world for myself has come a little bit full circle, and it is incredibly fascinating to look at where the market has been and where the market is moving towards. And I think you hit the nail on the head on a couple of things. So number one, decarbonization and air quality and this move to electrification is absolutely just going to happen and is happening today, especially in Europe, where EV and electric vehicles are being taken up in rapid order, depending upon the country in Europe. But we see that as really driving things. And that relates to decarbonization. So the lower we can get carbon in the environment, the impact from a positive perspective that it will have on greenhouse gases and ultimately our temperature and reducing that climate change that we are seeing today is really important, not just from a business perspective, but for a whole socio perspective as well. Air quality is one of the things that prior to COVID, the World Health Organization had as number one priority, as it was contributing to 7 million deaths per year. And a lot of those were in our urban centers today. So, love to talk about a number of the initiatives that Geotab has going on today that probably you and I ballpark, 14, 15 years ago didn't envision would happen. But it is, an incredible journey and a journey that we look forward to continuing as we're just on the in the inception of this decarbonization, as I would say, with the transport industry and telematics in general.
Interesting. Maybe we can kind of kick off with this. Just a small personal experience. I think most of us have had it. If you ever go to London and you have England and you rent a car and you drive down, unfortunately, into the center of the city, you're probably going to be hit with a ticket because there's a London congestion charge. And I think that a lot of the European cities have had this idea of a congestion charge ahead of almost anywhere else in the world. And I just, let's kind of start there because it's a fleet thing, and we're talking about vehicles moving around in cities and how we can be effective in cities. But the congestion charge, you feel it was a decarbonization topic, or what are your sort of thoughts? What have your experience been in Europe with respect to congestion in the city and how that all is playing out in the fleet world?
I mean, it's a great question and quite a deep question. So. First of all, when you're driving around in London, the first thing that I notice as a North American is you're driving on the left side of the road in the right side of a vehicle. So number one, so you have to be cognizant of that. And then as you're driving into a city center or city proper area like London, you understand that as you get in and closer to the city center, you're actually there's only certain vehicle types that are supposed to be going into the city center, and you actually pay a tax or a tariff as you're in that low emission zone. And it is quite interesting, that movement, which started in London in 2008. But if you look at it more generally, there's around 250 European towns and cities that have made a stance in terms of putting either a low emission zone, an ultra low emission zone, or even a zero emission zone tolerance in their urban centers. And it's, for those reasons that we discussed a little earlier around, making sure that we're not putting out carbon and diesel emissions and particulate matter into the air, to the environment that, people are living and breathing every day. And the overriding macro healthcare costs to, make sure that people are getting the right health checkups and as deep as it can go into cancer and heart issues, and those necessary surgeries to eradicate those issues is a massive burden on society. So if we can put in measures that will lessen that burden, that healthcare burden, that cost for all of us, I think is just a huge initiative. And transportation is front and center in this. And we really have, a responsibility as an industry to really impact this in a positive way. So that's a huge motivator for myself. For a number of years, I've been speaking about the Keeling curve. So the Keeling curve is the measure of carbon in our atmosphere. And it started off in around 1958. And today it's around 415, 416 parts per million. And if you look at the last 20 to 40 years, the curve has just gone, almost straight up. I like to use the hockey stick reference. So the curve has gone straight up. It's impacted climate and then again our health. And transportation is an area where, beyond the electrification, the leveraging of data to move goods and people through a city in a more economical and efficient manner will drastically reduce the carbon that we output in our environment and lower that Keeling curve. It's super important. It's an initiative at Geotab that I'm really proud of. We've really put a lot of horsepower, a lot of resources, both financially and people-wise, into really impacting the environment and making sure that we're leveraging data for good. And I think it's something that our whole industry is starting to do. Not everybody, and I think that Geotab is really at the forefront of this movement, and really grateful and proud of the team that's working behind the scenes to enable this.
About 2 months or so ago, I think that after, right now we're in this COVID situation, right? Whether it's in a lockdown or a gradual recovery, this podcast, I hope we listen to 2 years from now, and people will reflect back on how we were thinking in May 2020. But about 6 or 7 weeks ago, I remember seeing, satellite images over Italy and saying how clear the air is in Italy. And I think it's what was really interesting to me when I was talking to Matt Stevens and our EV team was separating the idea of CO2 from particles in the air. So what you're saying is it's spot on. The health considerations of CO2 and greenhouse gas is very different than even the particles that are in the air caused by diesel and other things that can cause the cancers and so on. And I was just seeing on the weekend, they were talking about here in Canada on a bridge that crosses between Windsor, Canada, and into Detroit. And just the multiplication factor of all the particles that are in the air caused by the trucks that are waiting in line to get across the border, and just how much of a hot spot that is for our health that isn't really being recorded. So I appreciate your thoughts on that.
It's very interesting. So one thing is CO2 and your carbon output in the air, but there are other invisible and deadly killers out there besides COVID, right? Which is obviously top of mind with all of us. And I think that once we are through COVID and knock on wood, we figure out that vaccine and we can all get back to maybe a more distance and digital economy, but something that I'm hoping we all move towards. But looking at other particulate matters such as nitrous oxide and other diesel particulates, even rubber, when it hits the road particulate matter is going into the air as well. So, there are ways that groups are starting to measure this particulate matter, and those have been around for a little while, but they're incredibly expensive and quite stationary. So you might have in a city center 2 or 4, stationary air quality measuring devices that are looking at particulate matter 2.5 as it's referred to, and this gives out relatively static measurements, and we feel that there's actually a little bit of a better way to do this. So we've been working with some very large and leading organizations and cities to come up with a solution that will put a mobile air quality sensor on top of an electric vehicle or bus that can travel around a city. And as it's traveling around the city, it's capturing this information. And similarly to how a vehicle today that has a temperature sensor and barometric pressure reading in it, an air quality sensor can provide this kind of particulate matter in a hyper local fashion, so that our big data gurus can look at this information and see a really good snapshot down at a very local level, an intersection or near a hospital area or a school area, on what is actually the air quality in that area. How does weather influence it? What is time of day doing to this? And we think it's an important initiative, and one that we are throwing some resources behind to really, help our societies. And as we move into, more low emission zones and zero emission zones, this type of information is really critical to help a city and urban planner be able to pinpoint where they need to stop traffic, or maybe just have electric vehicles, or maybe just walking street and bicycle streets as this evolution happens. So it's something that it's a fascinating topic in my eyes, and to Geotab it's important, and again it's data for good. And then I'll mention one other point. It's really fascinating that a company like Geotab, which started off as a family-owned business, that's been able to control its destiny because we don't have outside influences like venture capital or private equity investment. So we get to stay laser focused on the engineering side, which enables us to do initiatives like this and invest in the resources and the research and development to help our urban centers, which we think are critically important for the long run, as urbanization is only going to continue to increase post-COVID. So yeah, really, really interesting dynamics at play today, Colin.
Yeah, the concept of smart city was kind of one of these abstract expressions used by our industry over the last 5+ years. And, smart city was going to be really big. People really didn't quite know how to apply technology at smart city, just that cities were going to become smart. So I think you've just outlined a really good practical example of a smart city application of data and how it can change government thinkers about congestion and people's health, right? So that's a really good example of how Geotab adds value to smart city. In addition, over the last several weeks, we've launched something called a COVID-19 dashboard, which hopefully is just called the dashboard 2 years from now and not a COVID-19 dashboard, which monitors a number of different data points from fleet vehicles around the world in different parts of the world. Are there any specific highlights that you've noticed that have been impactful in Europe over the last month or so that you're going to keep a finger on the pulse and keep watching over the next summer months?
Yes, absolutely. So our recovery, of getting through this COVID is something that I think, the world's media and the citizens are really paying attention to. What's interesting is that the COVID curve and the flattening of the curve has put, data into the mainstream, right? So the measuring of people that are getting ill with COVID, through to deaths, and in between the severity of this illness and this disease is something that has put, data into the forefront of people's minds. And we think that what we're seeing today, and I obviously can't speak to the actual detail of this illness, but we've noticed it's gone east to west, right? So Asia, and then Europe, and then across to North America. And being senior vice president and seeing the impacts of COVID in Milano and Spain, prior to it really landing overseas, was really impactful, and something that we're fortunate enough that we have a leadership group on the team that was really looking at this in quite detail before it became a real health issue on this side of the pond. And then if I flip that a little bit, so we believe that we will come out of this COVID crisis, again, east to west, as things have plateaued, and the loosening of the restrictions has started to happen in Asia, and then is starting to happen in Europe, and then in a week, 2 weeks time, it'll happen over here, as we're actually even starting to see a little bit. And so this to me, the data that we provide, and some of people in our space, and maybe people that understand payments when transactions happen, and vehicle utilization, is a real barometer for the economy to quite a degree. So the movement of goods, the movement of medical supplies and food, is something that we can actually look at in some really finite detail, understand this movement, and then almost put a bit of a predictor on the recovery of the certain vocations in our space today. And with 2 million plus vehicles, we really provide a nice snapshot of this. And we're even working with one of our competitors in Europe, and we're looking at together our data, because we really believe that it provides a layer of legitimacy, not just Geotab saying it, but some of the industry leaders really saying it and coming together to propagate this message, so that we understand when we can come out of this, we understand, pardon me, in a little more detail as we come out of this crisis from an economic and movement of goods perspective.
Yeah, when you think about the old telematic systems that you and I used to work on 15 years ago, which was highly location-based services back then. It was really almost when OBD2 and CAN bus and even an accelerometer was a relatively brand new sensor back, in 2007, 2008. We were working with it, but it was relatively new.
Mm-hmm.
Today we've got all of this data at our fingertips. And I think when you and I were both selling against each other, now selling with each other, on locating where assets are today, I like to think that the technology and the data that we're providing provides business with strategic insights as to how they can rethink asset utilization. You mentioned bicycling in Europe, the idea of mobility and multiple modes of mobility, not just cars and buses, is really essential. How do you think Europe might be very different than North America in terms of its mobility message? And what lessons could North Americans, do you think, maybe could learn, or at least pay attention to, which is going on in Europe now, that I think that the rest of us in North America ought to be paying attention to for the future?
So that's a great question. And first I'll preface it by saying on that same panel that I mentioned that we were on together as in competing organizations at the time, I remember afterwards we were having a little side chat, you and I, and you showed me this OBD device that Geotab was coming out with. And I was just so jealous. I was like, oh man, that's what I need. So I found that really interesting. And the amount of data that Geotab collects, and the way that we collect data, the interpolation curve algorithm patent that Neil Cause put together for the group it's just incredible. So, the granularity of the data, and then understanding how that data can impact, from a small fleet to a large fleet to everything in between, to, urban planning and smart city. I think, we're just in the tip of the iceberg on that front. And I think, again, I point to some of the investment that we're making. We have, over 50 data scientists that are looking at how we can leverage this data for the socioeconomic benefit of our fleets, our customers, and our ecosystem, as really believe this underlying platform that Geotab has and been investing in for years and years, since before before you and I met. You were involved obviously in since day one. I just think it's incredible. 40 billion data points. So a little deviation. I wrote a story when I started. I was about 2 years into Geotab in 2014. I wrote a story about big data and the fleet revolution. And at that time, Geotab had around 200 million data points. And six ballpark years later, over 40 billion data points per day. And if you look at that, it's just incredible. And then as you start to apply machine learning and neural networking onto the data and look at, go into the data lake and look at, different things, whether it's, understanding when a minor collision has happened, or understanding, again, how to route people and goods better, more efficiently through an urban center and through our environment. It's just going to, exponentially continue to increase. There's areas of the data that we probably don't understand the impact yet that it's going to have on business and our environment today. And the fact that Geotab has been had the foresight to really invest in this space is going to pay off as we move into this digital economy.
Without a doubt. I think also being able to provide some benchmarking tools, which hopefully we'll be able to launch in more of a production environment for a business to be able to see their own business's activity and be able to benchmark their activity versus more of an aggregated view of their region. It's also going to be, I think, pretty powerful. Have you been working with any of the aggregating tools in Europe? Have you got the data sets out there to be able to do that?
So we're growing in Europe and growing rapidly. So we look at many centers from Rome to Madrid to London, Munich, Paris. So we have starting to get enough vehicles that are equipped with Geotab in that environment today to really put a good understanding of the data in that area. Of course, we have to aggregate, anonymize it, and security and privacy are at the utmost in terms of on our radar at Geotab. And we're starting to understand, yes, especially around EV take up, and then you asked a question earlier around other trends that we're starting to see in Europe. So Europe, because it's Europe isn't just Europe; it's multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, multiple regulations, multiple cities in a tighter landmass. So the amount of movement and mobility is easier to understand to a degree when a person might go on drive their car to a train station, jump on a train and go to a city center, and then maybe jump on a bike or a shared bike or a micro mobility type piece of equipment, scooter or what have you, to get to their office or a tube. So you're seeing that this whole path is starting to be understood and optimized by leveraging different types of technology to help people move about in a city center, and then to understand that movement to a degree, and not to understand it so that you can go look in on somebody, but to understand these patterns for the benefit of society. And I think that's technology and the digital economy is that's one of the big areas that is going to continue to be explored in the next months, years, and decade.
I know we're coming to an end of our time together, but I wanted to give you one maybe an opportunity to outline 2020 and your hope. What is your hope for the balance of 2020? We're almost at the mid-year point of 2020. It started out in January with a lot of excitement about what the year would hold for all of us, I think, around the world. And here we are. But what is your personal goal and your hope for 2020?
If my vision were 2020, that would be incredible, right? So I think that, all of us were all of us as a society and, as humans were sidetracked or, our feet were taken out from under us. But, said that, if you look at Geotab, and I'll focus there because that's where I like to focus. we started off the year and we were just continued on this massive growth mode, and the largest fleets in the world were moving forward and launching our technology, whether they're in the courier and last mile space, or in that rental or leasing space, or in that heavy trucking space, and everything in between. And it was just incredible, the trend and traction that we had, and really exciting. And then COVID hit, and there was trepidation and nervousness, and absolutely, we had to look inside and go, okay, yeah, this one's new, but let's get out in front of it, and let's put task forces together, and let's make sure that we're understanding our business deeper. And it's really enabled us to do that super deep dive into our every single department within the organization, and understand the business. And what we found is that there's certain areas that we can invest more in, and there's certain things that if we can do better, it's just going to help out our customers, it's going to help out our resellers, our staff, and the whole ecosystem in general. And I'm really proud of the fact that through April and into May, and as we're getting towards the end of May right now, we actually are seeing this uptick on business. It actually has continued to grow, now not at the same hockey stick level that it was growing at, but it's still growing from a net perspective. And that's testament to the product and testament to the people.
Well said, Ed. Well said. And I'm looking forward to ending 2020 on a positive note, and appreciate the fact that you had a hockey stick over your shoulder. That was a great prop. I'm sure it was there not by accident.
Non-intended, yes.
Hey, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been great catching up with you. I'm glad to see that you're well, and hopefully the entire team is doing well. We'll continue to work together positively with that great positive spirit that you bring to Geotab. So thank you very much for all of that. And with that, thanks again very much, Ed. And I want to thank our listeners today for joining Connected with Geotab. To stay up to date with Geotab and all things Geotab, go to our geotab.com/blog. All of the posts that we've talked about today are there, including Ed's one probably from 6 years ago when you wrote it. Maybe you need to update it, Ed. And including our community site, community.geotab.com, where you can ask questions and we'll be able to crowdsource those answers for you and be able to respond very quickly. So with that, I want to thank you, and we look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks again, Ed, very much.
Thanks, Colin. That's great. Thank you.